Good evening, those of you who remain. My name is Michele Sutter. I am a co-founder of MOVI, Money Out, Voters In, which is an all-volunteer grassroots organization that began here in LA, but is fanning out quite remarkably. We have very vibrant chapters in Santa Barbara, now in San Diego. We have a very strong affiliation in Washington, D.C., and we also are very closely allied, there you go, with the original Occupy New York folks. And this is, of course, a movement dedicated to a 28th Amendment, and possibly even a 29th Amendment, because it may take us a couple, to remove these conjoined twins that insinuated themselves into our Constitution, namely that money is the equivalent of free speech and that corporations are entitled to constitutional rights, that this idea of corporate personhood. And as most of you know, because this is an educated crowd, the idea of the Supreme Court's job, which is to interpret the Constitution, is really only about interpreting those areas that are not expressly set forth in the Constitution, right? There is a sort of a gray area, if you will, that they are charged with interpreting. And so what has happened is these two ideas insinuated themselves into the Constitution, and we'll talk tonight about how that happened and why that happened, because the tension has always existed. Corporate entities have always wanted to get the nose under the tent, as it were, but they were always thwarted. They made little bits of steps, but not much. But the moment that changed this, and this is where the environmental movement comes into play. The moment that changed this was actually April of 1970, which I'm sure I don't have to tell this room was the first Earth Day. And so in April of 1970, 20 million Americans participated in the first Earth Day. 20 million Americans. We had a population of 200 million at the time. And I know that a lot of those people weren't counted because I was in an all-girls school in Connecticut, and we participated quite vocally, and I don't think we were counted in that number, probably. So that happened in April of 1970. By the end of the year, Richard Nixon had created the Environmental Protection Agency. And by the end of the next year, 11 laws had been created to protect the environment. And I'm going to read those to you because it's a quite stunning list. The Clean Water Act, the Federal Water Pollution Control Amendments, the Clean Air Act extension, the Toxic Substances Control Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Eastern Wilderness Act, the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Resource Recovery Act, and the first fuel economy standards for cars, all in that year, all signed by Richard Nixon, who really wasn't interested in doing it, but the reason he did it was because 20 million Americans rose up together in one day and demanded it, right? So that event made one very important head explode, and that head was Lewis Powell. Is everyone familiar with Lewis Powell and the Powell Memo? Yes, and this actually predates his nomination to the court. So in August of 1971, Lewis Powell sat on 11 corporate boards, including the board of Philip Morris, and he believed that the American free enterprise system was under attack. And he wrote a letter to his buddy across the street who was in the Chamber of Commerce, saying essentially, no one can deny that the free enterprise system is under attack, and we have to do something about this. And so Lewis Powell set out in this memorandum an absolute playbook of what had to happen, of the public institutions that needed to be overtaken. He named college campuses, obviously the site of much unrest, and much of this environmental movement and various other movements, were gestated and came to fruition on college campuses all across the country. So that's got to stop. The other thing that has got to stop is we've got this darn liberal media. Anytime these activists get out there, they're on the TV. They were seeing what was happening with Vietnam as well. When the media, this liberal media, we need to insinuate ourselves, we need to buy up the media, and we need to be projecting the messages right there in the memo. And the third wing of this overtaking of public institutions was the judiciary. And he said, we have to get our people on the courts. We need activist jurists. He actually said this. And there were two actual individuals whom he called out in this memo by name, who needed to be discredited, vilified. One was Herbert Marcuse. I can remember my brother getting all excited about the critique of pure reason when I was a kid, my older brother. He was a professor on the Berkeley campus, less well known now probably than the other person whom he said we've got to take out.
San Diego.
In San Diego? Oh, it was UC San Diego? Interesting. Okay. I was living in Connecticut at the time. It was all Berkeley to me.
We forgive you.
Thank you. But the other one was Ralph Nader. He took special aim at Ralph Nader. And, we've seen, not just 2000, but well before that, the vilification of Ralph Nader and his ideas, these liberal ideas that are spreading. So he laid this thing out. And 2 months after he wrote it, Richard Nixon named him to the Supreme Court. Word of this memo did not leak until Jack Anderson, whom many may remember, Washington Post, yes, discovered this, and at the time said, and that was 1978, so it was after this had already happened, and he said, is Lewis Powell a fit person to be on the court given what he believes? So he's confirmed to the court, and this is the giddy-up moment for money equaling free speech and corporate personhood and corporate claim to constitutional rights. And that is evidenced by the two opinions that were handed down in the 70s, Buckley v. Vallejo, which was in 1976, which essentially equates money with free speech, and Bellotti v. the Bank of Boston, 1978, which is actually giving corporations constitutional rights. Both of these opinions were written by Lewis Powell. So it can, in fact, be said that it is the environmental movement that really catapulted the response, the systematic implementation of this need and mandate and raison d'etre of these people to claim our public institutions for themselves and cut us out of the process. So if we jump to today and what has happened here in California, many of you know that Proposition 49, the last time I spoke in this room to a slightly different gathering, but Carol and Charles were certainly both here, we were this close to getting on the ballot, and it happened. We got on the ballot. Against all odds, we were able to persuade our California legislators that this was an appropriate thing to do. They had already spoken about Citizens United in 2012, something called AJR, Assembly Joint Resolution 22, which called on the United States Congress to draft and pass a resolution to return to the states, overturning Citizens United. And as many of you also know, there's always that tension between direct democracy and representative democracy, and they felt, why should we speak again? California's spoken, we speak for California, and we were able to persuade them that since the Supreme Court were continuing to act with McCutcheon, which obliterated aggregate limits, right? The Supreme Court are continuing They've taken away sort of two of the pillars of campaign finance. There are two that remain. To this point, corporations cannot contribute directly into a campaign. They have to do it through the super PACs. And there is a limit of somewhere around $6 million of individuals contributing in any election cycle to a campaign. Right, right, right.
Right.
Well,
right.
come on. Why shouldn't they be able to do that? So that's the insane idea that money is the equivalent of free speech. So we were able to persuade them. We got on the ballot. Unfortunately, Governor Brown did not sign us into law, but allowed us to go to the ballot without his signature, which opened the door for the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, Pete Wilson, I think the Lincoln Club as well. I wouldn't be surprised if there were other familiar names that we all know who rained down upon us, because they know, because they've experienced it, when California has a conversation, that conversation spreads across the country. And that was an enormous part of what we wanted to do, why we wanted to get on the ballot in California, because we have to have this conversation. As you can see from this lovely map, and as you can see in any of the polls that anybody looks at anywhere, 80% of Americans agree that we need to do something about money in politics. I think that the majority of them have not quite synced this up to the concept of corporate constitutional rights, but that's only because they don't read about it anywhere, they don't hear about it anywhere. They have to be very attuned. Essentially, you have to be in the movement to know this aspect of it. And yet it is the aspect that most directly affects all of our lives, because corporations are writing all of the rules.